Hey friends, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. What time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? Dim the lights, lie back, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Tonight, you wake up in a cool, reed-walled hut by black water that smells faintly of lake mud and crushed leaves. A canoe knocks the bank. Somewhere, a willow shakes its thin silver leaves, and morning begins. One dawn on the chinampa, building an island from mud and reeds. You step outside and the ground gives just slightly, like a mattress under thin blankets. It looks like an island, but it is. It is a deliberate stack, reeds, brush, lake mud, more reeds, more mud, stitched and pressed until it behaves like land. Around you, narrow canals cut long rectangles into the wetland. This is the chinampa zone of the southern lakes, Xochimilco and Chalco, part of the shallow basin that once cradled Tenochtitlan. People will later call these places floating gardens. Under your feet, you learn the opposite. They float on effort. You watch the gardeners tie the bed down. They drive stakes at the corners, green, living stakes. Ahujote, the Mexican willow, slips into the damp rim and roots quickly. Its job is engineering, not ornament. Flexible roots grip the reed and brush lattice, hug the earthen sides, and drink the same water that wants to loosen the walls. Row by row, willows become a quiet skeleton. The bed beneath you is long and narrow, about 30 paces by 3. The shape is on purpose. Narrow beds keep every plant a few steps from a canal edge. Everything moves by canoe, the farmer, seedlings, compost, and later the harvest, wrapped in woven mats. Here, the water is the road. A man in a Megi fiber cloak kneels and draws a wooden rake through the canal. He is feeding the land. The rake lifts black muck, chinow, rich with decayed reeds, fish waste, and microscopic life. He flings it onto the bed in soft fans. Mats of cut tules and cattles go down first, then the muck, then brush again. It is a sandwich that never ends, a maintenance diet for living soil. Order hides in the marsh. Along the edges, young willow shoots are braided low to resist erosion. Canals are kept just wide enough for a canoe to pass and turn with one gentle push of the paddle against the mud. The widths are remembered in the body, a bed 2 to 3 meters, a canal, a canoe's sweep, a morning's paddle to market and back. Seedlings wait in small squares of earth called olmosigos, nursery beds on woven pads. On the bank, they sit like patient chess pieces, maize with its thin hopeful blade, beans that will later climb the maize, squash with broad heart-shaped leaves. Together they form the triad that keeps families alive. Maize for bulk, beans to stitch nitrogen into the soil, squash to shade the ground and hold moisture. On the margins grow amaranth, chilies, and herbs, because flavor and medicine belong beside calories. You learn that a chinampa is never finished. The lake tries to take it apart. The farmer quietly rebuilds it slice by slice. A year without dredging and repair would curl the edges and invite water in. Most years do not drift like that. There is always a canoe, a rake, and a pile of cut reeds. A breeze moves. You hear the small city of sounds that make a workday. The creak of a paddle, a heron's low call, the soft thud of muck landing on new soil. The market at Tlatelolco will later count harvests by the thousand, but the accounting starts here in simple arithmetic. Muck spread, seeds pressed, canals cleared. You kneel and pinch a clod. It crumbles between your fingers into something that is neither powder nor brick. Someone shows you a calendar strip painted on bark. It divides the year into working weather. A time to start seedlings, a time to set them out, a time when the lake rises with rain and the bed's shoulders must be raised higher. The northern lakes, especially Texcoco, are salty. The southern lakes are sweet. An earthen dike with wooden gates, planned by the engineer king Tlatelolco, keeps the waters mostly apart so these beds can drink what crops prefer. Midday arrives, and the willow's sifted shade becomes a tool. Water is ladled into squash depressions. A woman draws a thin line of mud along the bed's spine to slow evaporation, a practice taught by her mother and her mother's mother. Across the canal, another family unloads baskets of kitchen sweepings and poultry droppings. Waste is not waste. It is a promise that tomorrow's soil will be richer than today's. You chew a kernel of roasted maize and feel how it clings to your teeth before softening. In the afternoon, a wind picks up. The beds do not drift. Their woven undersides and rooted edges hold the shape of intention. You press your palm to the soil. It is cool and damp a finger's depth down, drier on top where squash vines will later stitch shade. A boy cracks open a clod and shows you flecks of shell where, years ago, someone emptied a basket of lake snails. Every pinch says the same thing: built, not found. A canoe glides in with flowers: cempasúchil, Tlatelolco, water lilies, orange, magenta, white. They smell of pepper and wet stone. They are not food, but they purchase what food cannot: obsidian blades, woven cloth, salt cakes. The chinampa is not only a place, it is a wallet, a policy, a dependable promise written in mud and willow. You notice how work follows a calendar of water rather than a clock. Plantings are staggered so that one strip of the bed holds seedlings while another ripens and a third rests under a thin mulch. Because canals never stray far, drought is a smaller fear here. A gourd dipper can turn water into yield with a few steps. When rains are late, beds are lifted with fresh mud. When water rises, edges are raised and willow roots knit the new height together. The result is steadiness. Several harvests each year, not in grand surges, but in reliable small waves that keep baskets full and markets calm. Evening thins the light. Willow leaves turn black against a pewter sky. You sit on the reed floor and feel the bed steady beneath you. It no longer feels like land. It feels like a decision held against water by continuous hands. Later histories will call these gardens floating, as if they drifted like rafts. But did the gardeners think of themselves as inventors at all, or only as people who dredged, braided, staked, carried, and watched, holding a city in place without naming the miracle they were making? You learn the shape of a whole valley by watching one bed. The basin of Mexico is a bowl with 5 shallow lakes laid like mirrors at different heights: Zumpango and Tlatelolco to the north, Texcoco at the center, and where you stand, the southern pair of Xochimilco and Chalco. Texcoco tastes of salt. These southern waters are sweet. A long earthen wall with wooden gates, the Alboradon attributed to Nezahualcóyotl, keeps the two tempers of water apart most of the year, so maize can drink without tasting brine. When storms drive waves northward or southward, men hurry to the gates with poles and woven screens, and the city waits for news about the flavor of its future. From your bed, the lines of labor run outward. Canoes carry soil, reeds, people, and tools, but they also carry rules. Land here belongs to families nested inside neighborhood groups, the kalpuli. A plot can be inherited, split among children, or extended by the simple, exhausting act of building more earth into water. Authority watches softly and persistently. If a bed is neglected, boundaries blur, and one family's lapse becomes a neighbor's problem. You see why edges are religious. That braided willow at the rim is kinship and law tied together. You handle tools whose names are older than the empire: a stout digging stick, a flat wooden shovel, a rake with long teeth for lifting muck, and a basket woven tight enough to hold wet earth. They are simple because they must be reparable at the waterside. A cracked paddle is a delay. A broken rake tooth can be replaced with a sharpened twig. Nothing is glamorous, and everything is necessary. The rhythm is not only agricultural, it is civic. Lists inked in books like the Codex Mendoza will one day state the tribute: maize, beans, chilies, amaranth, flowers, reeds, fish, frogs, that provincial towns must send toward the island capital. Your bed is a unit inside that accounting. It is commonplace to speak of feeding Tenochtitlan, but on the water, the math is quiet. One canoe holds a few hundred ears. One family can paddle 2 loads before noon. One market day multiplies those loads by thousands of hands until the plaza becomes a tide of green husks and orange petals. The market itself is a second city. You picture Tlatelolco at the northern end of the island, where rows of sellers keep to their kinds: baskets of tiny tomatoes, strings of dried fish, stacks of firewood, heaps of salt cakes, bundles of herbs that smell like clean dust. Judges sit on low platforms to police measures. Specialists verify weights with stone standards that feel cool in the palm. Payment can be cacao beans counted by sound, or cotton cloth folded to standard sizes, or blade money, thin knives of obsidian traded like dark leaves. Your vegetables do not talk, but they testify. The chinampa yields consistently, and the judge's eyes approve consistency. You return to the water and learn the city's plumbing. Fresh channels reach into neighborhoods for washing and cooking. Waste is not dumped at random. Canoe men make rounds to purchase and remove what households no longer want, including human waste. Spanish onlookers will later remark on the cleanliness and the recycling with a kind of baffled admiration. You see only the practical loop closing. Mixed with lake muck, ash from cooking fires, and chopped reeds, the unwanted becomes texture and fertility. You touch a bed that is also a ledger of everything a city has decided not to throw away. Pest control belongs to the same plain wisdom. Ducks visit and are welcomed because their hunger for larvae reduces mosquito swarms. Ash is dusted lightly where snails trouble seedlings. Water depth in canals is kept at a paddler's knee so that catfish and axolotls can live, but do not climb onto the beds. Shade from squash vines and willows lowers heat and slows evaporation. You hear no grand theories, only small reasons repeated until they become a landscape. Yield is a whispered measure here, spoken in meals rather than numbers. Yet if you look, you can count. Strips are staggered so that 2 or 3 harvests fit inside a year. Seedlings, set out already strong, outrun weeds. Water is always within arm's reach. Farmers you meet shrug at comparisons, but later scholars will calculate that these beds produced some of the densest pre-industrial harvests known. You don't need the numbers to taste the result. You need only to watch baskets come home heavy during poor rains as well as good. Belief threads through work without spectacle. Before the first setting of maize, a man knots a bit of white paper onto a willow branch and burns a pinch of copal resin. The smoke is a thin column, a routine request to Tlatelolco for rain and to Tlatelolco for the kindness of waters that move softly. On calendared days, families bring flowers to small altars at canal junctions. The petitions are modest. Guard the dikes, keep salinity at bay, let seedlings take. The theology is hydrology spoken in polite tones. Your body learns the distances. A day's labor is measured by how many times you stand and crouch, how many basketfuls you swing in an arc from canoe to bed. By afternoon, your shoulders thrum with the even ache of repetitive success. Children ferry seedlings in shallow trays, elders sit and sort beans by size for even cooking. A visitor could miss the sophistication because nothing shines. The sophistication is systemic rather than spectacular. You follow a canoe on its delivery circuit and notice that canals are not only water, but widths. A bend must allow a loaded boat to turn without scraping. A bridge must sit high enough for a standing paddler to slip under. The embankment must be sloped so that erosion is slow, but not so shallow that weeds claim it. Everything is a compromise memorized by bodies, and the bodies pass that memory forward the way others pass songs. As evening leans in, a headman from the Kalpuli walks the edges, tapping the rim with his pole, inspecting the braids, checking that corner willows have taken root. He asks simple questions. When did you last dredge? How many seed trays are ready? Which canal needs clearing? He is not planning wars. He is planning dinner for a city. The grandeur of empires depends on this audit in the mud. Clouds pile over the eastern rim of the basin, a telltale dark beyond the low ranges of the Sierra. Wind comes in low, shivering the willow leaves from silver to slate. You feel the bed's soft firmness and imagine the stress that waves will push against the banks if rain arrives hard from the south. The dike gates could hold, or a seam somewhere could split and let salt rush in. Willows can knit only so fast. Muck can be thrown only so high before water learns a new path. Tonight, as families coil ropes and set tools beneath mats, the question is ordinary and immense. When the storm draws its long breath over the lakes, will the web you maintain tighten or tear? Dusk closes like a lid and the smell of wet willow sweetens. You help coil the ropes and slide the rake under a mat where mice won't chew the handle. The sky is a single gray sheet. Somewhere far off, thunder steps across the bowl of the valley, slow and deliberate, each footfall echoing off the low volcanic rims. Everyone moves the way people do when they have done this many times. Not quickly, not lazily, just in the exact sequence memory provides. You push a canoe off the mud and join a small procession toward the dike. The Albradon is not heroic to look at, just an earthen back with a spine of wooden gates where fresh water and brackish press nose to nose. By torchlight, you see the wet shine of tamped clay and the pale ribs of squared timbers. A man carries woven reed screens, another carries stakes. They speak few words. The work is mostly touch. Fingertips on seams, palms pressed to boards, a brief ear leaned against a gate to hear if water is whispering where it should not. Wind comes first. It tumbles down the length of the lake, pushing a long heave that slaps softly at the embankments. Then rain arrives, not a sheet, but a steady stitching. Every drop is tiny and unremarkable. Their number is the news. The willows take the first of it on their narrow leaves. The rest trickles and gathers at the bed edges and down the slope into the canal, and from the canal toward the gates. You feel the load change under your feet. The chinampa does not float free. Its braided rim grips the mud like a hand, but the whole structure breathes, swelling a finger's width here, settling a hair's breadth there, like the chest of a sleeping animal. The headman calls for more weight on a vulnerable edge. You and two others ferry mats of cut tule and lay them thick along a corner where small waves have started to bite. A boy brings muck in a basket that leaks slowly black. You smear it along the bend with the flat of your shovel. It is not elegant, but soil asks for contact more than ceremony. The wind does what wind will. You answer with friction. Far out in the dark, you hear the different voice of Texcoco's water driven northward, then bounced back. No one says salt aloud. Everyone is thinking it. The gates are checked again. Screens are wedged into places where you hardly saw a seam before. This is the kind of engineering that looks like housekeeping, plugging pinholes, weighting edges, smoothing runs where eddies could grow teeth. It is a grammar of maintenance that never learned the word triumph, only the word again. Hours pass. In the torchlight faces shine with wet clay and the clean lines sweat makes on cheeks. Women bring thin gruel and gourd cups. Children sleep in canoes beneath reed mats, rocked by ripples that sound like breathing. Someone hums a tune that isn't about anything except endurance, the way a loom hums when the shuttle goes steadily back and forth. You look down and realize your feet are caked, your calves sugared in fine grit. You press a palm to the bed and it holds. That is the whole point and the whole miracle. It holds. Near midnight the rain slackens, wind unwinds. The lake's belly settles into slower breathing. When the headman finally says, "Enough," it isn't because the bed is safe forever. It is because tonight it is safe enough, and at dawn the quiet work resumes. Morning opens with thin copper light. The world has been laundered. Willows drip. A heron steps into the shallows as if it owns the dawn. You walk the rim, heel to toe, checking the repairs in the kind of inspection that is also gratitude. The edges you waited have darkened and sealed. The braided roots, wetted and patient, have settled tighter into the mud. On the far side, a neighbor's neglected strip shows a bite taken from its corner, a soft slump where a year without attention has revealed its cost. Two families are already there, hauling muck and tules to put it right. Ownership exists here, but isolation does not. The water makes neighbors of everyone. By noon, the routine has reasserted itself. Seedlings go in maize at the corners, beans to climb, squash to wander. A man chops reeds for mulch. A girl counts out chili seedlings into fours and sets them beside a rock for weight, the way her grandmother taught her. In the city, a priest may be raising a serpent scepter and calling rains by name. Out here, the prayer is in the steadiness of small acts. If you stretch your gaze beyond this day, you can watch the story widen. You see in one direction the long, draining centuries after the conquest, when foreign engineers bragged that a dry plain was a modern victory and the lakes were a problem to be solved. You see canals filled, causeways cut wider for carts, the Desagu ripping out a vein by which the basin had always exhaled. You see a city rising on clay that shrinks and swells, sinking by centimeters and then by meters, streets cracking because what once was water still remembers. And you still see, in a pocket of Xochimilco and Tlatelolco, long thin rectangles held by willows and custom, a mesh of persistence where axolotls hide in cold green and farmers push flat rakes through black water, lifting a future one basket at a time. In another direction, you see cities far from this valley relearning the quiet knowledge of edges, that wastewater can be workwater, that a bed built like a sandwich can feed more people on less ground, that a canal is both road and reservoir. The words are different, urban agriculture, circularity, green infrastructure, but the sensation underfoot is the same, a firmness that isn't arrogance, only the composite strength of fiber laid over fiber, intention pressed into mud, repaired before it fails. You stand again on the soft ground that isn't ground and try to put into one sentence the lesson it keeps repeating. It will not fit into one sentence. It fits into a daily practice. Watch the water, hold the edges, make the soil, send a canoe. When something frays, mend it while it is still small. The harvest will come in quiet multiples, more dependable than glorious. A city that understands this will sleep better than a city that believes only in walls. The lake surface flickers, tin silver under noon. A willow leaf lands on the water and spins, making a small tight whirl in a world of larger, slower currents. You wonder, as you lay down one last fan of black muck and smooth it with your palm, whether the wisest inventions are the ones nobody stops to name, because namming would pull them out of the fabric of habit. If the ground beneath a city is partly made of willows, waste, and daily patience, what else about our foundations could be rebuilt, not with triumph, but with tenderness? 2. The willow's grip, how Ahujotes held a city together. You wake to the whisper of leaves stroking water, a sound thin as brush on parchment. Dawn is cooler here along the canal edge, where trunks rise from wet soil like dark pilings. The people call them Ahujotes, willows that grow by any excuse. Push a green stick into damp ground and it becomes a tree. In this valley of lakes, such eagerness is not decoration. It is policy enforced by roots. You step along a chinampa rim and place your palm against a trunk. The bark is rough where knives have bitten, smooth where new cambium has sealed last year's cuts. Pollarded once, twice again, the crown never grows tall enough to shade out maize or squash. Branches are harvested on a cycle remembered in shoulders. The tree accepts this bargain. In exchange for light and space, it gives poles, twig bundles, kindling, shade at midday, and the most important gift of all, grip. Below the water line is the work you cannot see. Willows weave themselves through silt and reed mats, seeking what a tree craves, air, water, anchorage, yet accomplishing what a city needs. Roots stitch the beds flanked together into a living seam. During storms, when waves nip at the corners and water presses at the gate, the willow's underground hand holds. It does not object to mud. It likes the black peaty softness, the faint sulfur of rot that would sicken other trees. Where a cut branch touches soil, it throws roots. Where a fresh pole is jammed along a raw edge, it knits the bank the way a needle catches two fraying hems. You watch a family lay a new edge. First comes a low fence of fresh stakes, set 2 handspans apart, bottoms sharpened and driven through the woven reed base into firmer clay. Between them, the farmers braid green with green, flexible twigs crisscrossed with tule stems until a wicker wall emerges. Muck is thrown against it from the canoe, slathered like mortar. 2 boys tread it down with bare feet, laughing at the sucking sounds. Then someone slices willow shoots and tucks them into the wet seam, living nails that will pin the repair in place. In a month, the shoots will hold on their own. In a year, they will be trees. The Ahujote's metabolism is useful in ways that never make a speech. Leaves drink water with enthusiasm, then release it as vapor, thinning heavy air and drawing a faint breeze down the channel. After rain, that thirst helps pull standing water from the bed's shoulders. In a dry spell, each tree shares shade with tender seedlings, softening heat on the soil surface so mulch can do its work. Bees and flies visit catkins despite the plainness of the flowers. A garden that feeds people also feeds pollinators, and the exchange is not romantic, it is routine. You learn wood by weight and smell. Fresh willow is pale and wet, heavy with sap. Older pieces dry to a tough springiness. Bundled and bound, thin rods make hurdles to pen turkeys and keep dogs off nursery beds. Thicker poles become braces for canal bridges or ribs for small roofs. The bark, bitter with salicin, is boiled as a simple medicine for aches. Nothing about the tree is glamorous, yet you notice how many tasks today end at willow. Fence, stake, basket rim, rake handle, the low stool in the shade where a grandmother shells beans. Spanish chroniclers will later write about this landscape, Bernal Diaz remembering causeways and water everywhere, Sahagun's informants describing gardens and trees that held the earth from drifting. They will be surprised by utility in living things arranged so patiently. But here the surprise never existed. People and willows have been in treaty for generations. If a bed is a stack, a willow is stitch. If a city is weight, a willow is counterweight. Mid-morning you watch pruning. A man climbs into the crotch of a tree with a stone-bladed knife hafted in wood. Cuts are made on a slant to shed water. Branches drop and are sorted immediately, straight rods for weaving, crooked ones for fire, leafy offcuts for mulch. The stump will sprout again. It always does. A tree that resents this would die. The Ahujote seems to admire usefulness in itself. Shade moves, and with it the work. 2 women strip leaves into baskets for goat fodder upriver. A child stuffs soft green into gaps where the canal bank looks raw, then pats the seam with a willow switch as if blessing it. The scene reads as nothing much. Pruning, bundling, weaving, the slow choreography of maintenance, yet the sum becomes geometry. Lines of trees mark property, frame channels, and guide paddlers through a maze to market. Seen from a hill, the pattern looks like careful writing in a tight hand, margins ruled by living ink. Willows also carry law. Corner trees declare boundaries more reliably than stones shifted by flood or temper. If neglect lets a rim slump, the sag is public, not private, an accusation written in mud. Kalpuli elders tap trunks with their poles the way a carpenter taps a beam, listening for the hollows of inattention. A strong edge is citizenship expressed as botany. You pause at a corner where 3 beds meet. The oldest willow stands here, thicker than a man's waist. When floods came last season, its roots kept the angle from peeling open. That single holdfast saved 3 harvests. No one carved a praise song, they simply banked extra cuttings at its base, acknowledging a favor with another favor. In an empire that loves ceremony, this ceremony stays practical and almost invisible. At noon, the wind freshens and the leaves show silver undersides, whole rows shimmering like fish scales. The sound is cooling to hear. It runs down the canals faster than a canoe, a message that weather is turning gentle. You realize how often information here is environmental. A change of sound, a shift of shade, the tug of a current at the paddle blade. The willow speaks without speech, and people answer with tools. A canoe glides by stacked with poles, headed for a repair farther north. The paddler nods, then points with his chin toward the dike line, where white birds circle beyond the gates. He does not need to explain. If salinity pushes south, the first warning is in reeds yellowing and willow leaves curling like spilled paper. In a week of wrong water, these edges would parch and crumble. You feel the contingency under your feet, how stability here is built on the responsiveness of a tree and the vigilance of people who read trees well. The afternoon softens, families rest in scattered shade, eating tortillas warmed on flat stones, dipping bites into chili paste. Someone sets down a bundle of fresh-cut switches, still wet at the cut ends. The bundle leaves a dark print on the mat, an outline shaped like a tool chest. You think about cities that trust stone alone, kings who measure greatness in blocks. Here, strength is willing to be flexible. Here, power is woven, tied, rooted, and repeatedly pruned. Toward evening, men carry rods to market, building parts grown from water. Women carry baskets of herbs and flowers that grew calmer under these same trees. Children splash at the edge and are scolded gently away from the roots. The willows hold their posts, green sentries that never march, never boast, only drink, breathe, and bind. You look again at the living fence line, each tree a green knot in the cord that binds water to land. The thought arrives without drama. Perhaps the most reliable walls are those that grow back when trimmed. If a city can be braced by trunks that gladly endure the knife, what other kinds of endurance could be learned from a tree that works for its living? You follow a canal that threads south like a drawn breath, and the willows arrange themselves into meaning. Row after row, their trunks rise at disciplined intervals, corners thick with older trees, young shoots marking new claims where families have pushed land farther into water. From above, if you could rise with the white birds and look down, the pattern would read like a quiet script across the lakes. Long rectangles inked by trees, canals the spaces between words, dikes the margins that keep the page from smearing. The valley's logic begins with taste. North and middle sit the brackish expanses, south lie the sweet lakes. The line between them is never a law of stone, it is a negotiation of gates and wind. The Alboradon, that long earthwork often attributed to Nezahualcoatl, keeps the bargain most days, but the bargain needs attendance. Willows planted along embankments do the attending. Their roots bind the earthen spine. Their stems break waves that would gnaw at seams. Their thirst lifts water into laves and back into air. No decree can keep salt out. A living fringe can slow and soften what otherwise arrives all at once. You test the bank with your heel and feel the answer, firm, springy, not brittle. Behind the firmness is method. When a new chinampa edge is laid, stakes go in first. Between them, green rods are braided with tule until a wicker wall holds its own shape. Muck is pressed against that weave and patted smooth with paddles. The last step is the most important. Fresh willow cuttings tucked along the seam like pins. In weeks, the pins root. In months, they thicken. In years, they become a curb that grows tighter when trimmed. A bed so armed does not drift, and in this landscape, not drifting is a kind of wealth. Pollarding is the clock by which this architecture is maintained. Every year or two, depending on growth and need, crowns are cut low so light still visits maize and squash. The cut surfaces angle to shed rain. What looks brutal is care. The next season brings a fan of straight, eager shoots, exactly the sizes the household expects, thin widths for weaving, thicker poles for frames and hurdles. You lift a bundle and notice the texture, fresh willow cool in the hand, a wet green smell that hints at medicine. Bark shaved and simmered eases aches. The knowledge is not ceremonial, just domestic. Edges here carry lore as plainly as they carry plants. Kalpali elders make rounds, tapping trunks, eyes trained to read neglect the way a scribe reads a smudge. A slumped rim is not only a private failure, it endangers a channel, invites erosion into a neighbor's plot, hints that the owner is taking the city's stability for granted. Fines exist, but the sharper penalty is labor demanded at inconvenient times, dredging a shared canal on a cold dawn, hauling reed bundles for someone else's repair. The lesson is clear and boring and powerful. Your edge is also everyone's. The Ahujote's gifts spill into craft. Thin rods become fish weirs and funnel traps that breathe with the water, letting the smallest creatures pass while getting larger ones into creels. Medium poles brace small bridges. Thicker ones form the ribcage of sheds whose thatch sheds the endless damp. Baskets tightly woven carry muck, seedlings, chilies, flowers. Loosely woven ones carry air through produce so it arrives unbruised. Even the rakes and paddles lean on willow, handles that will not splinter into a palm on a long day. Shade is another slow utility. You stand beneath a row and feel the difference, a coolness like cloth dipped in water and wrung out. Tender greens planted along the tree line avoid burning, mulches last longer, soil crusts less after a dry wind. Catkins feed bees that wander over squash blossoms. Birds take the higher perches and repay rent by worrying at caterpillars and larvae. The canal at your feet deepens where roots nose outward, keeping a swimming path for axolotls and small fish, while the bank itself resists sloughing away. Every part of the tree recruits a partner, pollinator, bird, amphibian to make the edge behave. You push a canoe toward the dike and see how willows move from plot to policy. Along the Albredon, families have planted double and triple rows where waves slap hardest. The trunks rise like a palisade, but one that sways and survives. In the slop of wet clay, you find wattled panels pinned by living stakes, a woven skin that can be mended while the storm is still muttering. The technique has no heroes. 100 hands add small fixes that line up to become security. You begin to understand why later visitors, fond of chronicles about battles and kings, seem to miss where the real strength lay. Numbers slip into the day almost by accident. A bed roughly 30 by 2 or 3 paces keeps every plant within steps of water. A tree every few paces along the rim keeps roots interlaced. A pollard cycle measured by winters feeds a steady market for poles and baskets. In Tlatelolco, such steadiness is visible. You pass the rows where building wood is sold, bundles tied tight and graded by thickness. Next to them sit the sellers of flowers, of herbs, of vegetables that grew calmer under those same trees. Judges verify measures with stone standards. Buyers weigh the value of shade and grip without saying so, paying slightly more to those who arrive week after week with unblemished produce. The willows remember crises. Elders point to waterlines cut into bark, marks from seasons when the lake rode higher and pressed at the gates. They tell of a year when the wind drove brine south for days, when reed beds yellowed and some willows curled their leaves as if tasting smoke. The trees did not all die. Those that held shaded the mud until rains refreshed the channels, then leafed again. There is comfort in that stubbornness and a warning. When the margin is thin, only habits as stubborn as roots will save the harvest. Word travels of changes coming from the north. More canoes than usual carry loads of cut wood not for hurdles but for charcoal. New mouths in the capital want meat, which means more pens, more cookfares, more ash, useful if returned to soil, destructive if left to choke a canal. You watch a neighbor pile brush in a way that will not feed flame but feed beds, and the choice feels like a vote. On another bank you glimpse goats tethered too close to a rim, their hooves punch careless crescents into damp earth. A boy shoos them off and presses the dents smooth with his heel, a small act performed 1,000 times to erase a new risk none of his ancestors had to consider. Afternoon slides toward evening and the willows begin their silver act again, flashing undersides when a breeze runs the length of the water. You listen, and it sounds like pages turning. You think of how many parts of this city rely on such turning, cycles of cutting and sprouting, dredging and spreading, selling and sowing, repetitions that never aim at spectacle, only at steadiness. The trees have made a promise and ask one in return: trim me in time, bind me into your plans, read my leaves when the water changes. Ignore me, and the edge remembers how to fail. Beyond the gates, clouds are piling. Beyond the clouds, ambitions are piling too, new demands on wood, on land, on water. You rest your paddle against a trunk and feel a faint coolness seep from bark into skin. If a city is, in the end, a sum of dependable edges, and willows have been those edges made living, then the question that waits has no poetry in it at all. When the wants of the capital grow heavier, and strangers begin to prize quick fuel over slow routes, can a green architecture still hold the line? The pressure does not arrive as drama, it arrives as habits that look convenient. You see more charcoal kilns smoking on the northern shore. You hear goats jangling their bells along canal edges not meant for hooves. You notice gaps where pollarded crowns used to meet, holes in the palisade where a household cut too many branches too low because a new market in the island city pays well for quick fuel. The willow can forgive many things, but not impatience. Cut down to a stump in the dry season and left without water, even a generous tree dies. A dead edge is a teaching moment the lake takes. Storms test what prophet has thinned. One wet year the water rises and stays risen, pressing for months against the dike, and the reed-woven panels pinned there by living stakes. The city on the island shifts from boasting to bailing. Canoes move along streets between white walls. Willows along the Albredon do what they can, roots cinched into saturated clay, stems breaking chop, but a living edge asks for help, and in places receives none. When the water falls at last, you walk the margins and see the difference as plainly as a ledger. Corners held by old trees survived, corners stripped of their stitch slumped and spread like wet bread. New rulers bring new certainties. They prefer squares to long, thin rectangles, stone culverts to reed-wattled repairs, hard drains to the slow breathing of lakes. They talk about floods as if lakes were the problem and not the warning. They cut long trenches to draw water out of the basin. It is work of epic scale and unarguable skill, but every channel dug toward the north is also a memory erased. Where water lingers less, willows lose their taste for a shore. Without willows, banks crumble faster, and more earth washes away at the first brute storm. The logic closes like a hand. Drainage begets dryness, dryness begets subsidence. Subsidence asks for more walls and more drains, each answer tightening the need for the next. You step onto a bed that has been tended through the changes and feel the old, forgiving bounce. Here the treaty still holds. The crown of the ahujote is low and busy with new shoots. The root flare shows where silt has been banked and patted, season after season. Pollard scars red like a calendar in wood. The household's care has a texture you can sense with your feet. It is not nostalgia, it is survival by routine. Markets change in taste. Barges carry more wheat and fewer bundles of amaranth. Meat becomes common in some quarters, and the ash mounts from those fires. Some of it returns to soil, and beds darken with fine gray that holds moisture. Some of it clouds canals until men with rakes work through dawn, pulling out the mat of weeds and film, left to rot with cut reeds into a future's fertility. The balance is not philosophical, it is arithmetic. What goes back returns as yield. What does not becomes trouble you can smell. Centuries pass their quiet miles. Lakes shrink to remnant sheets, then to canals kept alive by springs and the stubbornness of people who refuse to forget what their grandparents taught. The capital, now built far higher and heavier, rides on clay that shrinks when dry and swells when wet. Streets crack, churches tilt. Engineers measure the drop in centimeters and then in meters. Deep wells drink from aquifers older than any city. The ground settles like a long exhale. And in the south, along stubborn ribbons of water, willows continue to rise wherever a green stick finds damp soil. The chinampa pattern thins, but does not vanish. A few neighborhoods keep the maze tight, still run by paddles and shoulders. You ride a canoe there on a mild afternoon, and the air changes temperature under the trees. Axolotls hide in the still pockets where roots make shade. Herons stand as if remembering a larger lake. Men repair a bank with the old motions: stake, braid, muck, press, tuck in a cutting, pat the seam with the flat of a shovel. Nothing here looks like innovation. Everything here is a technology that grows back. There are years when officials visit, speak of heritage, and write down what they see in the polite language of protection. There are other years when a paved road pushes closer and a developer imagines better uses for wet ground that does not bear weight well. The willows say the same thing in both moods, a green monosyllable repeated without fatigue: hold. Their method is not grandeur, but time. A trimmed crown renews. A cut branch planted well becomes a post. Roots draw water up and send it back as coolness. Bark yields a quiet medicine. Leaves feed goats that are tied at the correct distance from a rim. Poles become fences that breathe. The list is dull and essential. If you climb the slow stairs of history and look back down, the lesson fits in a palm. The willow gave the city a way to turn edges into organs, living, responsive, repairable. In the years when people honored that bargain, harvests came in modest multiples, canals stayed passable, and storms ended in mending rather than in grief. In the years when haste, fashion, or policy forgot the bargain, the same water taught the same correction with patient severity. The evening wind lifts, and the trees begin their silver speech again, leaves flashing as if someone were turning many pages at once. You imagine modern hands elsewhere, relearning the grammar, floodplains planted not walled, banks sown with roots that bind, wastewater treated until it can be workwater, cities measuring success not only by height, but by how softly their edges meet the places that move. The image is not dramatic. It is a ribbon of green where a city ends. It is a person with a shovel and a bundle of cuttings. It is the knowledge that some walls do not stand tall, they stand alive. You rest your palm on the bark and feel a cool damp come back to you, as if the tree were returning a borrowed moment of water through your skin. The canal is quiet. Somewhere beyond the low hills a paved city thrums and sinks by slow degrees. Here, a trunk leans into its duty with no speech and no pride. You think how many problems are edges asking for the right kind of seam, and how many answers are waiting, patient as roots, for someone to plant them where they belong. 3 mud dredgers of Tlatelolco, feeding a lake-born capital. Before first light, you are already knee-deep in a canoe. The hull is plank smooth from years of hands and baskets sliding along it. A pole lies along the gunwale. Beside it wait the tools that define your morning, a rake with long wooden teeth and a tightly woven scoop that can hold water for a breath. You push off while the stars still show, and the lake answers in small rings that widen and vanish into the reeds. On still water, labor begins before the birds think to sing. You aim for the darkest water where yesterday's breeze combed the marsh. The bottom there is plush and heavy. It is not only mud. It is the lake's memory, leaf fall and fish scale, crushed snail shell and soft algae, a dusting of ash washed from cooking fires, and the fine leavings of a crowded city settling out in slow weather. You press the rake until your hands tingle from the teeth bumping firmer clay, then pull, slow and even. The scoop dips, rises, drains, and you tip the haul into the boat with a wet thud that smells of rot and green things. The blackness looks like nothing, and it is everything. You will move 2 measures today, the inner count of how many basketfuls you can lift before your shoulders complain, and the outer count of how much edge the family must rebuild and how much bed wants thickening. A chinampa never declares itself finished. Water never stops testing lace. Your work is to keep the lace dense, to turn slippery memory into something that will hold a harvest and the footsteps of a child. No one praises this, and that is part of why it works. By grey dawn you reach the strip. Others have begun. A sister lays a mat of cut tules along a soft corner, overlapping them like shingles. A cousin braces a low wattled fence of green willow between sharpened stakes. Your load becomes paste, pressed against the weave with the flat of a paddle. The paste bleeds a little water and then firms. You move down the rim, smear by smear, the way a mason lays mortar. Only your bricks are living, fresh willow cuttings tucked into the wet seam until the edge is a hedge. The bed does not float free. It is pinned by roots and manners. Between the beds, the canals need their own lifting. Silt settles, weeds knit a film, passage tightens until a canoe humps through like an animal under a blanket. You and a neighbor haul the tangle up and drop it on a rack to drain. Later it will go back to the bed as mulch. Here, even the word waste has a short life. The lake gives, the city gives back, and the border between gift and refuse is managed with baskets, not speeches. The rattle of reeds on wood is the sound of a contract being renewed. Other ingredients arrive that make soil more than dirt. Kitchen sweepings come in baskets, poultry droppings and goat dung in sacks. In the neighborhood's upriver, collectors make steady rounds to gather what households would rather not keep, including human waste sealed in jars. Some is sold by the gourdful, some by the boatload. Mixed with lake muck and chopped reeds, turned and warmed under mats, it becomes a dark crumb that holds water and feeds slowly. You do not name elements. You name results: sturdier maize, beans that climb and fix their own breath into the soil, squash that shades the ground and keeps it from cracking. Seedlings wait in nursery pads woven of reeds and lined with fine earth. Families like them sturdy before they ever meet open wind. A child brings out squares of damp soil, maize with narrow blades a hand high, beans with the first feelers, squash with a wide green palm. You pull back the mulch and set each at a spacing learned by eye, close enough to shade the ground by midsummer, far enough that each root finds a clean path down. The logic repeats like a prayer you no longer need to say aloud. Water within steps, soil always growing, edges always mended before they fail. The morning stretches into repetition: lift, drain, spread, press. The flat of the paddle becomes a hand that persuades mud to behave like shore. Your feet learn where the bed is firmer. Your knees memorize the angle that makes the smear right. When a corner slumps, nobody scolds. They fetch more cuttings and sew it up. The capital's appetite is a pressure you do not need to discuss. It arrives as a daily list. Repair that seam, thicken that shoulder, deepen that bend so a loaded canoe can turn without scraping the bank. Grand designs are made of small angles. Sometimes you carry muck not to your own strip but to a neighbor, because canals are shared and a bottleneck steals everyone's time. The headman of the Kalpali walks by, counting boats, noting which section needs a crew day with extra hands. The books in the temple district will later write tribute in neat lines: maize, beans, chilies, reeds, flowers. But those entries begin here in boatloads of black that never get named, only moved. Without this lifting, lists become threats instead of promises. At noon you eat, sitting on the mat edge. Tortillas taste better after you rinse your hands in the canal, and the water cools the heat that work has stored in your palms. A heron steps the shallows, pretending not to be a partner. Children scoop tiny shrimp with woven sieves and shout at axolotls they are not allowed to keep. The life you add to the beds matches the life that hides among the roots. Quiet abundance sits in both directions, smelling faintly of warm clay and crushed leaf. In the afternoon, you follow a delivery run to Tlatelolco. The channel widens, the city lifts, white on white, stepped platforms reflecting a sky now high and pale. Canoes queue with bows touching the landing. Sellers grade your produce with practiced hands. Their standards are petty in the best way: no cracks in squash skin, maize ears even and full, herbs damp and clean. Near them sit officials watching measures, comparing bundles, keeping the market honest in 1,000 small corrections that almost no one notices. You trade by countable things: cacao beans, folded cotton cloth, blade money like thin leaves of obsidian, and push off lighter. Returning by a side channel, you stop where men pry up a floating mat of waterweed. They sigh in rhythm. The weed steals passage and light, but it also traps the fine silt that would drift away. You think of the big drains cut in the north and how, in strange wet years, they hurry water out of the basin and carry with it what took hands months to lift. You prefer the slow routes, the ones that end again on a rim under a willow, where you can press the day into shape with a paddle and know exactly where the strength came from. You pass a crew repairing a bridge. The stringers are willow, the deck reeds bound tight. A paddler tests clearance with his pole, angling the canoe with a single touch so the bow kisses the bank and swings free. Everything has a right width when your tools are your body. A canal broad enough to turn without scraping, a bed narrow enough to weed without trampling, a load that sits on one shoulder without bruising the collarbone. Palace builders might set walls by rope and rod. You set edges by memory in the muscles. Evening brings the smell of wet clay cooling. You moor the canoe, lean the rake to dry, and stretch until the ache changes from sharp to friendly. Tomorrow will ask the same motions, and your hands will answer. There is nothing heroic in these gestures, yet they are the hinge between a lake and a meal. If the city sleeps well, it is because tens of small boats have spent the day lifting the lake and laying it down as ground, a transfer so ordinary no one stops to name it while it happens. You lie on the reed floor and feel the bed's soft steadiness under your spine. The willows whisper. Far off, a wind pushes wrong water toward the gates. In the market, a price shifts, and somewhere a neighbor weighs whether to sell willow poles for charcoal instead of cutting them longer for repairs. You close your eyes and picture the city without daily lifting, without the black paste that turns water into bread. What becomes of a lake-born capital if the people who feed its soil stop pulling memory from the water and pressing it back into land? By the second morning, you can hear numbers in the water, not the numbers painted in tribute books, but the ones your shoulders count, the weight of one scoop of muck, the time of 3 strokes between bed and canoe, the length of a canal in breaths. The basin of Mexico is a bowl, and the bowl is ruled by arithmetic you carry in your back. At the neighborhood shrine, a small board lists work that isn't negotiable. The elders call it tequittal obligation, set by the Calpuli and Talid, not in coins but in mornings. Your household owes 2 days each moon on the shared canal, 1 day on the dike, and steady upkeep of the bed's edges. Miss the rhythm and the canal silts. The market trip stretches from an hour to 2. The price you get for bruised squash falls by a handful of cacao beans that once read as certain. Everyone understands that a city rests on upstream choices, and upstream here often means the man in your own mirror. You push out while the sky is pink and the lake lies with its face blank, pretending it has no moods. The gatekeepers at the Albradon stand with poles braced, listening to the push of water on either side. Salt and sweet bargain at those boards every week of the year. Nezahualcoatl's earthwork does not keep a perfect separation. It keeps a discipline. When the wind leans from the north, screens are dropped, panels wedged, willow hurdles tied tighter along the seam. When rains fill the southern lakes, the gates open to level the bowls without letting bitterness creep south. Your baskets depend on their ears. Canoes pass in both directions with a gravity that never hurries and never quite rests. Builders head north with willow poles for repairs along the dike. Gardeners head south with baskets of dredge and kitchen sweepings that will become soil. Almost no boat goes empty. Even a paddler traveling for news carries a bundle of twigs that will be steaks by afternoon. You learn to read the traffic as an index of the city's appetite. More canoes with reed bundles in early rains, more with baskets of flowers when festivals stack up, more with fish and axolotls after a quiet month when nets were mended and patience paid. It is easy to romanticize mud when your hands have not lifted it. In the boat, the black paste looks the same every time. On the bed, its differences matter. Dredge from near the reed banks is fibrous and springy, good for an edge that slumps. Dredge from deeper lanes runs silky through the fingers, rich with the fine silt that roots love. The best mixture takes both, layer, pat, so water rises into the bed like breath, but does not punch through when waves throw themselves against the rim. A good smear sounds dull under the paddle, a thin one rings. On some days you haul not to your plot, but to the Calpuli's repair. This is the plainest form of politics, muscles lent to the margin between order and mess. A boy pulls new willow cuttings from a soaking trough. An older woman shows him how the cut end must be slanted and pressed at a downward angle, not straight like a spear, so roots find soil faster and the shoot catches the weave like a living nail. No one praises the instruction. Praise is saved for harvest. Repair is a kind of quiet worship that repeats too often to be called ceremony. Midday draws you toward the avenues of water that climb into the heart of the island city. Causeways cross above, pierced at intervals so canoes can thread the undercuts. A larger one carries the aqueduct from Chapultepec, its twin troughs delivering clean water, a redundancy with wisdom inside it, because one can be cleaned while the other runs. You feel the temperature change where a feeder stream meets the canal, cooler on your calves, and understand why fresh drinking jars stand shaded in the inner courtyards rather than at the canal edge. Mud feeds the beds, the aqueduct feeds the throat. Both must be kept apart and in conversation. Tlatelolco's market watches your arithmetic and answers with its own. Judges sit on low platforms with stone weights. Sellers place bundles in measured ranks. Buyers grade by the boring standards that keep civilizations from guessing. No worms in beans, no rot at the heart of an onion, no untied bundles to confuse a count. Your dredging has entered that calculus long before you arrive. If you skimped on soil last season, the chili plants flagged at noon, the leaves wrinkled at the margin, and the fruit came thin, everyone who buys can see it and pay you accordingly. If you kept the bed fat and the edges tight, your produce speaks without your mouth. You notice how often the words clean and full are synonyms here. Canoes that haul household waste are regular callers, not embarrassed visitors. They pay small and they save large. Mixed with reeds and lake mud, left to heat under mats until it turns from sharp to sweet, the city's leavings become the dark crumb that keeps water where roots can find it. You carry a basket of that crumb and feel the weight of appetite transformed into yield. A city that forgets to complete that loop would rot at one end and starve at the other. The people here have decided, over generations, to be tidy for reasons that can be eaten. Afternoons belong to canal maintenance. Weeds are not enemies, they are reservoirs with ambition. You lift them out in sheets, let them drip until their water returns to the canal, then carry them to the bed to dry under a scatter of chopped tule. In a week they will be brown, in a month they will be soil, in a year they will be the invisible part of a squash. The longer you work, the more you understand that nothing disappears. It only changes costume. Some days the arithmetic pains the eye. A neighbor sells too many willow poles for charcoal. The gap in his rim shows bright water where there should be green. Another family tries to hurry a bed by laying mud without a woven face. The next storm will take it back in an hour. Farther north, men with plans cut longer drains. They speak of floods and progress. You press a hand to your own edge and feel how the old answers hold because they are meant to be held, not admired. Admiration is for plazas. Edges need calluses. Evening slides softly, and the willows sing their leaf song, the same cool whisper they used on the day you first put your hands into the water. You lean the rake where it will dry, count the baskets by habit, and watch a canoe slip past with flowers stacked like a careful sunset. Orange marigold and magenta Tlatelolco, destined for an altar where water, soil, and people are thanked in the names of gods who like steady offerings more than fervent speeches. The city glows, white upon white, a place too large to think about all at once. So you think about tomorrow's angle of the paddle, the seam that needs a pin of green wood, the bed that will sag if you pretend not to see it. What does a capital become if the arithmetic of baskets and gates is forgotten, if the gates are left to memory and the baskets to luck? And where would you stand then when the lake decides to teach its lesson in its old patient way? One dawn the lake sounds wrong. No fish seller calls, no friendly scrape of paddles along the planks. Word runs along the canals like a cold wind. The aqueduct from Chapultepec is cut, and armed boats are gathering on Texcoco's open water. You step into the canoe and the old tools stare back at you, rake, scoop, bundles of willow poles, suddenly reassigned. Tequitl, the duty that once meant dredging for edges, now means lifting mud for barricades. You pole toward the causeway and meet others doing the same, boats nose to nose in lines. Men in the water wedge sharpened stakes into the clay, a fence meant to snag hulls. Your rake, built to coax silt, now pulls weed mats up to knot into tangles that will foul keels. You help pack reed fascines with black muck and pass them along a human chain to be dropped into channels where an enemy boat might try to slide. The lake is still the road. You are trying to make it a thicket. The arithmetic of baskets shifts overnight. Loads that used to fatten beds now shore the city's ribs. You smear mud into gaps blasted in the causeway, then watch it shear away under the next assault. By day, brigantines with sails and oars prowl the water, their sides biting through reed screens and willow hurdles. By night, you and your neighbors pull up stakes and rebuild them closer to shore, hopping to force a misjudged turn, a crack of wood, a delay. Repair becomes resistance. The motions are the same, the purpose has turned. Food thins in a way you can hear. In the market, fewer baskets arrive, then fewer still. Maize ears lose their shine, chili heaps flatten, beds go untended because hands carry spears or tend the wounded. The careful staggered plantings that kept a city even through poor rains cannot hold shape when canals are battle lines. A child asks for tortillas again before noon. You say later and hope you are not teaching hunger as a language. Disease had come early, months before, a fever and breaking of skin that took people who had never seen such marks. After it, voices around the water sounded fewer. Now siege lays its own hush. The gates in the Albradon are no longer the variable that matters. Boats with cannon are. You try to make artillery obey mud. You wedge reed bundles tight, dump dredge in the shallows until the water becomes paste, and for a moment a heavy hull grinds and stalls. The moment is brief, but brief moments are what repair knows how to make. Weeks arrive like stones. Cortés, allies ring the lake. Causeways become teeth, broken, spit out, rebuilt, broken again. You move along a channel narrowed to a thread, dragging weed into clots, tucking willow cuttings into any seam that still looks like a seam and not a wound. Men who once sold flowers now haul water in jars from far wells because the aqueduct sits severed and dry. Women trade recipes for gruels that stretch what remains without surrendering to smoke and ash. Still, the arithmetic cannot be lied to. A city that fed itself by tending edges is now bleeding at those edges faster than hands can clot. You're sent south one night to the chinampa belts near Xochimilco, where the pattern still holds. In the moonlight, the long rectangles look the way they always have, willows making black cursive along water. Families that are doing what you know how to do, pinning banks, tucking cuttings, dredging muck, trying to keep the dependable promise alive. You join, grateful for the old boredom of useful repetition. Then a messenger arrives whispering that fighting has reached the southern channels. The familiar steadiness becomes a staging ground. You stand in your canoe and feel, with a kind of stunned clarity, how quickly repair becomes logistics and how hard it is to feed two hungers at once. By late summer, the city is a puzzle missing its middle pieces. Streets flood and dry and flood again with blood and lake water. The smell is metal and rot and wet wood. On a morning of hard light, the fighting stops. The white walls watch without speaking. You drop your rake in the canoe, and it makes a noise that sounds like a door closing. August 1521 leaves a date in the mud that no paddle will erase. After the fall, you move because everyone moves. The new rulers still need soil moved and water managed, only now the orders come in a different tongue. You lift black dredge and spread it on beds again, because even conquerors must eat. Some weeks you are sent to clear drains toward the north, deeper cuts that hurry water away. You work and wonder what a basin becomes when it forgets to breathe slowly. On a cold morning you pass men measuring with chains where the old lake used to spread, planning the long works that will carry floods out through Huhuatoca. They speak of safety. You think of the quiet pact that used to hold edges here and how safety once meant attention, not absence. Years turn, the market changes face and smell. Wheat appears. Meat becomes ordinary in some quarters, and ash grows more plentiful. Some of it returns to the beds and makes them dark and springy again. Some of it clouds canals until a crew of neighbors paddles by at dawn to lift it, patient, the way your grandparents lifted weeds. There are days when the pattern recovers itself. Willow stakes tucked into a new seam, squash vines knitting shade, a child ferrying seedlings with grave pride. There are other days when a corner slumps and no one comes, and the water speaks its old sentence over the neglected edge. You pole a quiet reach near Xochimilco where the water is still green and cold. A heron lifts, arrogant and unhurried. Your paddle bumps a willow root that has thickened into a small knee, slick and tough. You press your palm to the bed and feel the familiar give, the softness that isn't failure but design. The city beyond is louder and heavier than the island you remember, and it sinks by slow degrees because clay remembers water even when people pretend not to. Yet here a bed holds because someone kept boring habits intact. Dredge, braid, pin, pat, plant, mend. You look down at your hands, lined with the memory of 1,000 basketfuls, and imagine a future city asking for the same dull rescue. Edges that respond, soils that are made and remade, canals that double as roads and reservoirs, wastes that return as wealth. The lake waits, patient as always, for the answer people will give it in baskets or in promises, in fences of words or fences of willow. If we forget the arithmetic and the pact and the old grammar of repair, what will the water write, slowly and without anger, over the places we wanted to stay? For market day at Tlatelolco, vegetables, flowers, and quiet power. You arrive by water before the heat wakes. The canal widens and the city rises pale and layered. causeways running like careful stitches. Your canoe noses among others toward the landings below the Great Plaza. The market is already breathing. Low voices knit themselves into a hum. You step out, and the ground under your sandals is dry-packed earth, swept before dawn. The air smells of wet reed mats, crushed episode, and the green sweetness of vegetables that were still on their roots a few hours ago. The space is arranged like writing. Rows hold to rows. Sellers of like things sit together so a buyer can compare without walking the width of a lake. Vegetables first. Stacks of maize ears still in cool husks, beans in shallow baskets sorted by color and size, squash lined like quiet drums. Chilies sit like coals, green to red, their heat caught and quieted in woven trays dampened against dust. Beside them, amaranth heads glisten with the faint sheen of recent dew. A child fans flies from a pile of tiny tomatillos, not from disgust, but because neatness is a claim to a better price. Beyond the produce drift the scents of the lakes. Fish are laid with stems of willow leaves for coolness. Eel and carp, prawns in net bags, axolotls slick and mild-eyed in wet baskets. Near them, men sell salt in cakes stamped with marks, their edges squared so measures can be trusted. Farther on are insects and their careful preparations, roasted chapulines, crunchy and tart, ahuortl, that delicate lake egg gathered from rushes, pressed and dried into thin cakes that break with a clean snap. Everything sits, by its own kind, not for beauty, but for verification. You walk into color. Flower sellers have built temples of scent out of marigold, dahlias, water lilies, and woven garlands that look like soft ropes. Petals shine as if the morning were still inside them. They will go to household shrines and to altars, but many of them will go to doorways and cooking spaces because beauty here belongs with ordinary life. Herbs create another green country. Culantro, hoja santa, yerba buena, and things you can only name by their uses. This for stomach heat, this for the ache that comes with weather, this to scent a mat before a guest sits down. The market holds materials that stand between plant and building. Reeds tied in sheaves, tule mats in layers, baskets from coarse to exquisite. Fresh willow poles for repairs, longer ones for bridges, straight rods for hurdles. Potters have stacked comels and jars in pyramids that climb to a man's chest. Nearby sit rows of sandals, magi fiber cords, nets, rakes, digging sticks, paddles, obsidian blades and scrapers set out like a black alphabet. Copper bells ring dully when a buyer tests them, not for music, but for the reassurance of soundness. Officials sit on low platforms at the edges of the lanes. Judges, market overseers, weighers with their stone standards and lath balances. They do not declaim. They look and measure. They settle small arguments about cloth size or bean counts. They confiscate false weights. They post a fine in cotton cloth or a day's labor where needed. The authority is not only in their staffs or their attendants. It is in the presence of familiar weights. The seen fact that a quatchley of cotton is a certain size and weave, folded to a known standard, and that 5 of those make another unit without surprise. Not all trade is barter, and not all payment is cloth. In your hand, cacao beans feel warm and faintly oily. They click softly when counted into a gourd. A cloak can change hands for a known number. A day's worth of firewood carries another number. Blade money, thin, leaf-like knives of obsidian, serves in smaller trades, though their edge is often more useful than their count. You watch a woman buy chilies. The vendor pours a measured cone into her folded cloth. A tiny handful of cacao beans passes back. No one writes it down. The market remembers for both of them. Bargaining reads here as courtesy, not aggression. A buyer touches a squash, presses near the stem to test for sweetness, looks at the seller rather than at the ground. A price is named, then a smaller one. The two meet not at drama but at agreement. The measure you notice most is the bundle. Firewood tied to a forearm's thickness. Herbs bound to a thumb's clutch. Flowers in dozens. Beans in counts that match the size of a folded palm. Even eggs have their neatness. Turkey eggs in 12s, lake egg cakes in stacks of 4s. The city has taught its hands to be rulers. Pochdecker, the long-distance merchants, hold a quieter court along one side. They unwrap packets of fine feathers bright as water, copper axes and bells, cacao in bulk, cochineal red trapped like sunset in tiny dried bodies, cotton of a softness you can feel from your eyes alone. They bring news with their goods, whose road has been closed by quarrel, which town asks fair tolls and which requires flattery. They bow to their own patron in their own houses, but here they bow to weight and measure like everyone else. Even far places must be expressed in counts that can be checked. Between the lanes move tameems, porters with padded tumplines across their foreheads, backs bent to half-houses of baskets. They speak little while moving. When they stop, they squat and breathe and drink from gourds, then lean forward and become legs again. Their strength is part of the market's accounting, a reminder that everything that appears effortless has a body beneath it. You see a porter adjust a strap for an older woman, then take her bundle at no charge. The gesture reads as grace, but it is also policy. Customers who return make a plaza steadier than any law. Law waits in the corners, patient. A man with a false weight is brought to the platform and his stone is tapped, listened to, replaced. He pays in cloth and leaves his face closed like a door. Cheating is not grand enough for spectacle. The penalty is calibrated to discourage performance. The market asks to be boring, and its power grows from how often it succeeds. At midday the hum thickens. Buyers from the city's wards arrive, cooks carrying lists in their heads, stewards for great houses checking off measures with fingers against palms. A priest's aide buys flowers without touching them, his lips move, naming a festival 3 days away. You feel the web this plaza throws over the rest of the valley. Beds dredged in the south, salt scraped in the north, obsidian cut on mountain skirts, cotton woven in towns that hum with their own looms. All of it is translated into a language of piles and bundles anyone can speak with their hands. You sit for a moment in the shade of a reed screen and let the sight flatten to calm sheet. No speeches, no drums, only the small arithmetic of trust. A city this large eats because the counts hold. Your chinampa at home earns its money here. Your household's attention is visible in the even green of your squash, the full straightness of your maize ears, the absence of bruises in your herbs. The judges will not praise you. The market will, by allowing you to be ordinary and profitable at the same time. You watch a buyer examine a cloth, fold it, measure the fold against his hand, refold until the layers match a remembered thickness. He nods, payment passes. Somewhere a gourd clicks with counted beans. Somewhere a weight thuds back into its basket. The plaza keeps its breath even, as if the city's heart preferred a slow, regular pulse to any show of force. You wonder, as the light whitens toward afternoon, how much of an empire's strength lives in such quiet arrangements, and what happens to power when the hum falters and the bundles no longer mean what everyone expects them to mean. By early afternoon, the plaza settles into its true speed, neither frantic nor slow, the kind of steadiness that takes generations to teach. You slip back into the lanes and begin to notice the parts you missed at dawn, the fittings that make an enormous exchange behave like a kitchen tabletop. A crier walks the perimeter, voice even, repeating rules everyone already knows. Where fish must sit, where firewood belongs, which quarter today will host sellers of game. He gives news as measure, not excitement. Gates on the causeways are open, a road to the west is muddy to the knee. Judges will inspect weights again after the sun clears the high wall. Order is a comfort you can hear. You pause at the bench of a weigher. He keeps a nest of stone standards, smooth, palm-warm, each with a tiny notch that marks its value. Buyers present their measures, baskets, gourds, bundles, and the man compares volume and weight by habit until his hands move without thinking. When someone's basket is found wanting, the correction is simple. More beans added until the head of the pile rounds to an even hill. No one sulks. The embarrassment is small and private. The way a shirt fixed at the collar makes a day better without needing an apology. Across the lane, cloth sellers lay out quatchly, cotton mantles folded to recognize sizes. The best are soft, evenly woven, free of burrs that scratch the wrist. Lesser grades show themselves in the way light catches their coarser weave. A steward from a household counts out a set for wages, folding and refolding to make the stack exact. Payment in cloth looks awkward only to strangers. Here it reads as solidity. A quatchly keeps the rain off a back today and purchases salt tomorrow. You watch a woman exchange a small, serviceable mantle and a handful of cacao beans for chilies, onions, and a clay jar. She leaves with dinner and with value she can still spend. The cacao gourd clicks steadily around the plaza, a soft drum of trust. You tip a few beans into your palm. They are not uniform, some larger, some shrunken from age, but they pass in counts that all sides accept. For tiny trades, obsidian blades fill the gap, their thin leaves changing hands as if they were bits of midnight you can store in a pouch. People do not speak of prices as absolutes, but as fair places where counts meet, a habit that allows markets to breathe with the season and the rain. The lake breathes here too. You see it in the wet mats under baskets, in willow leaves tucked against fish, in the dampened lanes where water has been sprinkled to keep dust from coating chilies and herbs. Sweeping never stops. Men with twig brooms move through like quiet stitches, pulling stray husks and dropped petals toward the edges. A boy carries a basket only for trash. He walks with a small pride, because tidiness is a civic office here. Refuse is not thrown. It is gathered for the canoes that ferry it back to soil. You pay attention to the faces of the judges. They do not frown to look stern, they look interested. Two sellers of salt quarrel in voices that do not rise. A judge weighs the cakes, checks the stamp, feels the texture against his thumbnail. He decides by doing, not by speech. One man bows and adds a finger's thickness to his blocks with the flat of a knife. Another pays a small fine in beans. The matter dissolves into the plaza's steady hum. Some lanes smell like travel. Potchdecker unroll feather cloaks whose colors seem to come from inside the cloth. They show copper bells that answer with a good sound when tapped, and cochineal sealed in little packets that release a red as sure as sunrise when wetted. Their talk, when it happens, concerns the quality of roads and the temper of toll keepers. They bring far worlds into this one without asking the market to change its grammar. A bell still weighs what it weighs. A red still sells by measure and trust. Elsewhere the plaza teaches domestic economics. A woman with a child at her hip buys 1 gourd of beans, 2 hands of greens, a palm's worth of amaranth, and a small cone of salt. She counts quietly, then trades half a cloth and a little cacao. Later she will peel the beans, grind the amaranth, and fold a meal around her household's day. Nothing about the purchase is romantic. Its virtue is predictability. The same counts tomorrow, unless the lake rises or the road fails, and the numbers must shift to keep the exchange fair. Porters kneel in a shaded strip and retie loads with maggie fiber cords. One adjusts his tumpline with a twist learned in his bones, then rises and becomes motion again. You realize how much of this city's wealth has legs. Canoes carry the heavy miles, backs carry the last dozen steps. There is no coin to do the lifting. People do it, and the market answers by keeping bargains legible to bodies. Bundles at forearm thickness, cloth in known folds, jars sized to a hand span and another hand span. Not all the plaza is food and tools. A row of healers lays out dried leaves and roots, shells of salve, little packets of ground bark. You recognize willow by scent, bitter and familiar. A woman asks for something to cool a fever. The seller opens a packet and speaks in ounces and mornings, not in wishes. Next to them sit scribes with their paint pots, ready to record a debt, a marriage gift, a dispute settled in cloth. They work in lines and dots and symbols the judges also read. Memory here is both spoken and painted, and that redundancy is a kind of mercy. Heat tilts the sound toward afternoon. Deals grow fewer, slower. Sellers splash a little water on herbs to keep them lifted. A runner from the ward council posts a small notice on a reed screen. The shared canal south of the plaza will be cleared at dawn 2 days from now. Every household owes a body. The market tells you what the lake will look like by the end of the week. You see with a small, grateful yawn how exchange, drainage, planting, and rule all hum along one wire. When you finally shoulder your own empty baskets, the plaza is still full of answers you did not have to ask. You earned enough cacao for salt and a repair bundle, enough goodwill to borrow a porter for an elder's load, enough quiet to carry back into the reeds. On the way to your canoe, you pass the fish sellers again. The willow leaves under their catch have dried and been replaced without comment. A tiny order, repeated, made the difference between spoiled food and supper. You push off into the canal, the markets hum thinning into water. You count the folds of cloth, the beans in a gourd, the feel of the paddle in your hands, and wonder at the size of a city that can eat and keep its rules by touching, weighing, and speaking in counts. If such a plaza holds power without coin and keeps memory without paper money, what happens the first time strangers insist that value must sound like metal to be real? You return on a day when the plaza looks the same and is not. Rumor has walked ahead of you along the canals. Tall boats with cloth wings were seen on the eastern lake. Men in iron came to the island city and asked to see the market. You steady your canoe as if steadiness could be borrowed from wood. The buyers arrive as guests, led in by lords who want to show power without shouting. They cross the threshold and pause the way travelers do when the scale of a place argues with what they imagined. You watch their faces tilt at the rows, vegetables in ranks, fish with willow leaves for coolness, beans graded by size and color, flowers in stacks of orange and magenta, cloth folded to known measures, copper bells that answer with a good sound when tapped. They see judges on low platforms and stone weights that do not argue. They smell crushed epizode, damp reed mats, clean mud. They call the number of people a wonder. You feel only the usual arithmetic underfoot, bundles, counts, lanes, not a miracle, just a day keeping its promises. The visitors ask questions about value. You guide a hand to a gourd of cacao and let the beans click, then to a folded quachly and its measured weight, then to a leaf-thin obsidian blade that can be both tool and tender. You watch them try to hear trust in a place where prices are spoken and checked by grasp, not struck in metal. Their coins shine in the sun like a small argument. Your plaza prefers dull certainty. Food moves as always to kitchens that measure hunger by mouths. But outside the market's borders, movement changes. Causeways thick with watchers, canoes idling at landings, a taste of iron on the air when an armored man passes. The aqueduct from Chapultepec still throws its cold into jars in shaded patios, yet you notice how often people prefer to draw water from the canal and heat it until it tastes of fire. Rumor rides clean water faster than dust rides a road. Then war comes, and the plaza's grammar bends. Canoes that once carried beans and fish carry men and stakes, ropes and reed hurdles for the gates. The crier's voice thins. He still walks the rows in the mornings and announces what lane sells what, but his announcements include hours when the market will close early, instructions about which causeway will be passable, notices of labor demanded for dike repair. Sellers of flowers bring fewer garlands, sellers of salt cut cakes thinner to meet the day's small money. You still see the judges weighing and tapping stones with their fingernails, but they settle more quarrels about scarcity now and fewer about bruises on squash. Siege turns the market into a ledger of loss you can read with your nose. The fish lane smells older by noon. Chilies sit longer and darken at the tips. Beans arrive in smaller baskets. A woman who once bought a cone of salt buys a finger's worth and presses it carefully into a pouch. Cloth changes hands as payment more often. Cacao beans are counted in tight, controlled clicks. The plaza stays dignified even as its scale shrinks, but it cannot force canals to open or causeways to hold. When brigantines cut across the lake and the aqueduct is severed, you taste the plaza's stubbornness. Order performed in a square that cannot feed itself without water. The day the city falls, the market is quiet. August 1521 writes its own rule across the basin. You move among stalls where reed mats lie flat and unused. Stone weights sit like moons. For a long while afterward, the plaza feels like a room where someone has spoken too loudly. The new rulers count in reals and tomans and require writing in their script for debts. You learn the shape of those numbers with your hands the way you learned caca by sound. Some measures change. Others refuse, bundles still tie to forearm thickness. Cloth still folds to known sizes. A fair weight still feels true at the wrist. Population falls fast and stays thin. Waves of sickness leave holes in lines that never close. Voices you used to hear at the fish lane do not return. Wheat appears in baskets, animal fat in pots, cheeses that carry a field sourness. Meat becomes ordinary in quarters that have coin. Elsewhere, households keep the old arithmetic of beans and greens and amaranth, counted out with fingers against palms. Cacao continues in small trades, then recedes to luxury. Blade money becomes tool more than tender. The market keeps selling answers to the question of dinner. It just speaks with a changed accent. Canals narrow, some filled outright. Drains cut toward the North pull floods away and silt with them. Barges come less often from the south, then mostly for festival flowers and the stubborn produce of surviving chinampas. Porters carry more of the city's load on their backs along streets that once were water. Judges still sit. Waits still tap. Scribes write in two systems at once, pictorial tallies and letters. Trust finds new routes. The habit of display in rows remains. Centuries later, you walk the place that remembers the market and see a different square. Stone from three histories on three sides, the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. Apartments look down where Rose once sat. Traffic speaks louder than reed brooms ever did. But if you stand still, you can hear the hum that built a capital, the low arithmetic of bundles, the discipline of lanes, the boredom that kept promises. You visit Xochimilco and watch a seller paddle in with marigolds stacked like sunrise. You realize the plaza never entirely died. It moved outward, split into hundreds of tianguis across a city that keeps growing on clay that remembers water. Lanes appear on Thursdays in one barrio, on Sundays in another. Weights tap, hands measure. The dumb power of daily counts still feeds millions. You step back into a canal in the south on a morning with no wind and think about value that doesn't ring. The willow poles ashore are graded by usefulness, not by shine. A basket holds because hands knew how tight to weave. A judge's face stays calm because correction is a kindness to the next buyer. In every direction, the lesson is homely. A city's strength is the ease with which strangers can agree on a fair handful and a fair fold. You push off, the paddle's nose drip loud in the quiet. The plaza is behind you, but its rules ride with you in the waist and wrist. If a market can hold an empire's appetite by being predictable and plain, what happens to power when we forget how to keep our promises small and exact? When we let noise replace measure, or shine replace weight, or coin replace the slow trust of a gourd clicked full. 5. The fresh and the salt, dikes, gates, and the taste of water. You crouch at the lake's edge and touch what decides a harvest, taste. The water on your fingertips is soft and faintly sweet, a coolness that leaves your tongue calm. A few canoe lengths north, beyond a low wall and a line of trees, the same lake carries a different sentence, bitter, a little slick on the lips, the taste of brine teased out of clay by sun. In this bowl of 5 lakes, flavor is geography. Cities live or fail by whether their mouths learn the difference. The basin of Mexico is a shallow dish with no easy drain. Rains fall in summer, storms walking in from the east. Winter is quieter, the sun drinking as if paid to be patient. In the center sprawls Texcoco, wide and brackish. To the south lie Chalco and Xochimilco, shallower and sweet, fed by springs and rivers that carry mountain cold into reed beds and chinampa lanes. Between them runs a line that is never quite a line. Wind pushes, gates answer, mud shifts. To keep the bargain, people built a wall that looks like a long thought. They call it the Alboradon, an earthwork laid low and practical with wooden sluices where water must pass. Later books will name Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king of Texcoco, as its architect. The work itself credits more hands than names. The core is clay tamped until it rings under mallet. The faces are wattled with reeds and willow fascines, then armored with more clay and mats that can be replaced after a storm. At the most bitten places, where waves slap hardest, men have driven thicker posts and woven panels tight, a living fence pinned by green stakes that will root before another season of rain. You walk the spine at dawn with the gatekeepers. They carry poles and short-handled paddles, coils of cord, a basket of reed screens, a pouch of pegs. Their tools are not heroic, their attention is. One kneels and presses his ear to the boards of a sluice, listening for the telling rattle that means salt water is nosing through an unseen seam. Another squints at the surface. Brackish water wears a slightly different light, a skin that wrinkles sooner, foam that refuses to die. The oldest man does not speak until he has tasted from a gourd on each side. A ritual so ordinary it doesn't feel like a ritual at all. What the dike promises is not perfection but tempo. When northerly winds heap Texcoco's body south, the gatekeepers lower screens and wedge the boards. When the southern lakes rise fat with summer storms, the gates open to share the burden without letting bitterness creep in. The task is to turn an oncoming shove into a push with pauses, so willow roots can hold, so beds do not slump, so seedlings find water they like. If the Alboradon is a wall, it is one that breathes. If it is a poem, it is written in mud and corrected every week. You stop where a side channel meets the spine and watch a repair. The lake has been busy nibbling. Men set sharpened stakes in pairs, lash willow rods between, and make a wicker ribcage. Others pass baskets of black dredge from the canoes, and the flat of a paddle persuades the paste into the weave. A boy follows, tucking green cuttings into the seam the way a tailor pins cloth. Women lay bundles of tule along the base to break waves, then tap the clay with paddles until it shines faintly, a skin a storm will have to argue with. Every motion here is a habit. Behind you, the southern lanes already stir. Canoes with seedlings slip toward their beds, others come loaded with kitchen sweepings, ash, and poultry droppings to be folded into the soil. The dike is not an isolated project. It is the rim that makes those repetitions meaningful. Without it, you can still plant. You cannot count on taste. Maize sets a narrower ear when watered with brine, beans sulk, squash loses its gloss. A bitter summer writes itself into the market months later. More cracked jars of pickled things, fewer bright peppers, flowers that arrive tired at mid-morning. Along the spine, willows do half the thinking. Their roots stitch the clay, their trunks break chop into soaked rags of wave, their leaves drink and exhale, pulling a faint breeze along the gates in heat that would make hands clumsy. Pollarded low, they don't steal light from chinampa rows. Cut on a cycle, they resupply the very repair that keeps them alive. The trees do not need an order to be useful. They need attention measured in seasons instead of speeches. You learn the signs of water out of place. Reeds yellow first when salt lingers. The froth that piles at a corner tastes wrong on the tongue, a lesson gatekeepers absorb with no drama. Along the fresher side, you see axolotls idle under shadow and hear frogs arguing. Along the brackish side, you hear wind scuff more than life. The delicacy is in the balance. Close the gates too long and the sweet lakes flood your neighbors. Open them unwisely and a month's work frays in a single night. Noon turns the clay tacky. You sit where the spine bends and watch the aqueduct from Chapultepec stride in the distance. Twin troughs on stone legs, clean water marching toward the island city. The old hands here respect that work and also mistrust the comfort it brings. Drinking water is not field water, jars are not beds. The city must sip and swallow without letting the two become confused. You have seen households that draw canal water for cooking when the sun has made it a soup of living things. You have seen others carry from the aqueduct and save their beds for the kind of water that does not leave salt behind. Good habit is a kind of law that needs no decree. Afternoons belong to inspection. The gatekeepers step the spine heel to toe, tapping with poles, searching for soft spots that mean seepage inside the fill, watching for boils where water forces up through sand with malicious patience. A boil gets a ring of mats, a wreath of reeds, a weight of clay, a prayer under the breath addressed less to a god than to the human future who must walk here next week. Out on Texcoco, whitecaps chase each other. Along Chalco and Xochimilco, willow leaves play their silver game in the wind. The alborodon stands between tastes, not pretending to be stone, preferring instead the survivability of being repairable. You carry a gourd and share sips with the men. The difference is subtle until you go back and forth, letting your tongue teach your memory. One kind of water seems to sit on the surface of your mouth, the other goes in. Seedlings know the same lesson without ever needing to be taught. The hush here is not reverence, it is concentration shared among things that do not speak. Evening eases the lake flat, and the light makes the spine look longer than it is. You think about years when the wind stayed wrong and salt pushed hard. You think about the flood seasons when gates could not be closed fast enough and the clay smeared like wet bread. You have heard elders name the seasons by what the water did to the city's tongue. A wall of mud and wood cannot abolish risk. It can turn panic into chores. You rise, shoulder a coil of reeds, and start toward a soft corner the old man tapped with his pole before he trusted his feet to move on. The lake lies to everyone equally. It tells the truth only to those who test it. A city that sits between fresh and salt must learn to sip and to spit and to know when each is correct. If the gates fail, or the habit of tasting falls out of fashion, or the wall that breathes is asked to be proud instead of patient, what flavor will tomorrow write in the mouths of those who plant at dawn? You learn the year by the way water speaks. In early rains, the southern lakes fatten quickly, a cold clarity folding down from springs and ravines. In those weeks, the gatekeepers walk the alborodon with a gait that looks casual and is not. Boards are lifted, screens pinned back, and the long wall becomes a set of open fingers letting surplus pass toward Texcoco without untying the knot that keeps bitterness north. In high summer, afternoon winds pour from the north like a hand across a bowl. Then the same men lower screens, wedge boards, and turn the wall into a palm that resists. Between these opposites, the city learns a tempo. Open, ease, close, hold, taste again. Signals arrive before numbers. Foam piles oddly at a corner. Its bubbles die slowly on the brackish side and quickly on the fresh. Reed leaves lose color from the tips downward when salt lingers. Willow leaves curl along their length instead of at the edge. Axolotls vanish first from channels that have tasted a breath of the wrong lake. Frogs shift to deeper ditches where roots shade the bank. The keepers catalog these things without pride. Pride is for plazas. Edges ask for listening. You walk with them and feel how every tool belongs at this border. A pole to test depth and firmness. A short paddle whose broad face can smear clay or slap down a rising boil. Coils of cord to tie wattled panels. Pegs that bite when hammered into damp wood. Reed hurdles woven in advance and stacked along the spine like rolled mats, ready to be pinned across a seam to break the bite of a wave. From the boats, a steady stream of black dredge arrives the way capital arrives to a treasury, quietly made of 1,000 small decisions upriver. Where the wall meets a causeway, the grammar changes, but the sentence is the same. The roads to the mainland are themselves embankments with pierced places, sluices and removable spans, so water moves and boats pass. Men tend those pierced places with the same attention the gatekeepers give the Albradon. If a road becomes a dam, the city pays for its pride with foul canals. If a channel becomes a shortcut for brine, beds to the south, accept a lesson they did not ask to learn. You watch a repair at one of those joints, the place where errors like to happen. Stakes go in as pairs, willow rods are threaded between them on the diagonal, a wicker skin appears, then darkens under paddled smear of dredge. Women sit and twist bundles of tule into fat ropes that lie along the foot like sleeping snakes, a baffle to gentle the shove of small waves. Children fetch green cuttings from a soaking trough and tuck them into the seam, angling the cut end down so roots feel invited. By next season, the seam will be alive. In 3 seasons, the living parts will need pruning to keep their usefulness tidy. Here, even success makes its own chore. You taste water with the old man who insists that the tongue is a better instrument than any charm. Your mouth learns the difference as quickly as seedlings do. A gourd from the Texcoco side leaves a thin residue on the lips you want to wipe away. A gourd from the south sinks into you and disappears. On a day of high wind, you can taste the shift hour by hour and understand why the keepers never leave. The Albradon is a wall only in the way a heartbeat is a drum, always repeating, always adjusting, never final. Across the basin, other works share the burden. Far west, 4 springs at Chapultepec feed the aqueduct that strides toward the island on stone legs. 2 parallel troughs walk that length so one can be cleared while the other runs. A keeper there listens for leaks with his ear against the stone, the same posture you saw at the lake. He thumbs moss away from a seam and smears clay into a narrow crack. He is not a priest of water, not a general, just another guardian of small continuities. Jars in courtyards fill with that cold, while kitchens and beds accept canal water, a city that confuses the 2 ruins both. The year rolls forward, and the wall stores crises the way a tree stores rings. After a season of early storms, the clay along the windward face shows a weave of hairline checks. Those checks will want smoothing before they join hands in the next blow. Following a dry winter, the willow roots along a high reach sit a finger's width proud of the clay. They will need fresh muck and a patient paddle to tuck them back in. In a month of inner heat and outer wind, small boils appear where groundwater presses upward through sand, each one ringed with a mat, fed a diet of clay, and told quietly to stop. The keepers read these marks the way a mason reads a wall that remembers its own weight. You stop at a small shrine on the spine where someone has placed flowers, a habit older than titles and younger than reeds. The offerings are modest, marigold heads and a bit of copal resin, a thread of cotton tied to a willow twig. You understand the liturgy without translation. It thanks the habit of repair. It asks for weather small enough to be mended before it teaches larger lessons. At midday, a delegation from the Calpuli arrives to fulfill its tequitl at the wall. Obligations are counted not in coin, but in mornings. So many crews each moon to haul dredge and lay it where keepers point. So many shoulders to carry poles. So many hands to braid hurdles and pass pegs. The men joke under breath while working. The women hum. A child falls asleep on a dry mat in the shade of a low pollarded crown, as if to prove that when adults do boring things well, children do not have to learn the names of disasters. The wall is nobody alone. Elsewhere in the valley, people measure the wall's success in their own languages. Gardeners read it as steadiness in squash skins and the even green of chili leaves. Fishers read it in the return of frogs to a ditch that tasted wrong last week. Market judges read it in how long fish keep sweet on willow leaves before noon. Scribes who like to set names to deeds write Nezahualcoatl when they paint the history of earthworks. The keepers along the spine answer to fewer syllables: uncle, neighbor, the man with the good ear. Storm memory is part of the work. Elders remember a season when salt rode south for days, when reed beds freckled yellow and willow crowns sagged like tired heads. They remember the opposite, a sum of swelling freshwater when gates could not be closed fast enough and the wall learned humility. Between those, most years come in manageable measures. The lesson is not grandeur but proportion. A wall that breathes can turn catastrophe into chores, and chores into a habit that keeps a city fed. Late in the afternoon, the wind freshens from the north and you watch as small screens are dropped, their reed faces trembling at the first shove. The keepers squat, compare goods again and nod. Down the spine, a runner posts a notice at a reed screen: canal clearing at dawn 3 days hence. Every household owes a body and a basket. You know what that work will look like: weed lifted in sheets, let drip, carried to a bed and spread thin to dry, then turned under next week. The wall is not a single project. It is an aperture that makes all that repetition worth the repetition. Toward evening, you climb a low knoll and look across the basin while the light flattens into pewter. You can trace, almost with a fingertip, the pale line where the Albredon rides, the causeways, stitched crossings, the black mirrors of quieter water cupped within canals. It is easy to say someone built a wall. Harder, but more truthful, to say people built a behavior and then gave it a backbone. You remember rumors that run ahead from the north and east, men who prefer straight drains to breathing walls, who like to make water leave rather than learn to speak with it. The breeze turns cool on your cheek, and you taste the day's last gourd again, sweet, ordinary, correct. If the keepers age and fewer hands know how to hear foam, if the city chooses drains that forget to ask lakes for permission, if coins begin to set the schedule of mornings that used to be counted in chores, will the line between fresh and salt hold its courtesy? Or will the basin step back to its older truth and teach everyone, slowly and without anger, how flavor becomes fate? Wind stacks Texcoco like a shoulder against a door, and you walk the Albredon listening with the keepers, gourds in hand, tasting the day into sense. Screens go down, boards wedge tight, reeds tremble and settle. The wall works as it always has, by admitting that water argues and answering with patience. You sleep that night under willow shade with clay under your nails and the faint sweetness of the southern lake still on your tongue. Years change their clothing. After the conquest, new planners arrive with straight tools and straighter ideas. They walk the spine and prefer endings to negotiations. Floods will be ended, they say, by cuts that hurry the basin's water north through the hills. The wall that breathes looks to them like indecision. Crews gather, surveys are made, channels are carved toward Huhuatoca and beyond, long works that promise certainty. You carry baskets there for hire, black dredge turn from food back into geometry, and watch water take the invitation out. For a time, the promise holds badly. The sky misbehaves in the 1600s, rain staying until the bowl brims. Texcoco presses beyond manners, over tops of walls into streets. Boats that once glided flower barges become household furniture. Thresholds learn the wet language of doors that never dry. The plaza measures the flood in noses and in hunger. Somewhere a judge taps his stone weight on a platform you cannot reach without paddling. The city endures years where prayers and physics tie and neither wins. When the waters at last decline, the new channels deepen, are widened, are named victories. The breathing wall grows old in memory. Work changes flavor. Drains pull not only storm water, but the fine, precious silt that made beds springy. Canals, slowed of their negotiable currents, gather scum and annoyance, then get filled for streets that bear wheels better than hulls. The aqueducts hold, but more mouths ask for more water, so wells are sunk deep into the basin's clays and deeper still into older aquifers that will not be quickly replaced. You walk old crossings and feel something new underfoot, the tremor of ground settling by degrees. Clay shrinks when dry, swells when wet. Buildings learn to bow, Door frames remember different heights from one lifetime to the next. Dryness, it turns out, is a kind of flood held in slow motion. In the south, survivors keep a smaller version of the pact. Among the last long rectangles at Xochimilco and Tlatelolco, willows are still trimmed low, cuttings still tucked on the angle, dredge still lifted in mornings that smell right. You pole there in late light and watch axolotls hover like thoughts in green shade. Children ferry seedlings on reed pads. An elder tests a corner with the flat of his paddle. A woman pats a seam until it shines faintly, satisfied. The wall is gone in many places, but the behavior remains wherever hands remember it. Beds hold, squash knits shade. A boat to market still carries the arithmetic of dinners. Elsewhere the city grows heavy with its certainties. Streets lie where canals were, drains where ditches negotiated, concrete where reeds soften chop. The straight cuts do their jobs until storms come that are wider than planners, and floodwater looks for a language it remembers. It piles where Phil has forgotten it, runs where a buried channel still draws it by habit, teaches the new districts that old maps are not dead. You stand in a storm and hear your grandparents' words in the rain on metal roofs. Edges, edges, edges. The lesson ripens slowly into the century you can name. The city sinks by meters because the old bowl is an animal of clay and memory, and because thirst taught hands to pump past reason. Engineers measure, recalibrate, post diagrams. They speak now of subsidence, of fractured pipes, of lost head in aqueducts that must be raised again and again to find their old fall. You watch a church tilt and know the basin's body is taking back its curve. And yet the old quiet answers keep returning, sometimes under new names. Wetlands restored in pocket, stretches to hold storm pulses. Canals kept open as roads for water as much as for boats. Reed beds planted to sip impurities and exhale cleaner flow. Fields that agree to be floodplain part of the year so that neighborhoods downstream can sleep. In design sheets and meetings, the habits you learned with the keepers walk back in with different shoes. Green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, circular water. You smile at the renaming and are glad all the same. The lake does not mind what you call courtesy if you practice it. You climb what used to be shore and is now a street lined with walls. A truck passes shaking a bell for drinking water. A worker lifts a lid and listens to a main the way a gatekeeper once listened to a seam. Taps cough and clear in an upstairs kitchen. The glass fills with something colder than the canal ever offered. In another quarter, someone boils a pot from a neighborhood pipe because trust runs on different clocks in different places. Taste was once the first test in a gourd at dawn. It is still the last test, only now the tongue has to remember more kinds of wrong. At Xochimilco, you help on a morning repair. Stakes in diagonals, wicker wall, dredge, paddle, tuck, pat. A school group passes on a gaudy boat and takes pictures of flowers. A gardener in an old straw hat rows by with a crate of greens so even they look ironed. He nods at your seam, says bien, says nothing else, and keeps going. The simplicity feels like the future, not the past. In that moment, you can imagine a city that rebuilds its edges as organs, not as borders, that learns again to sip from one source and water from another, that carries its wastes back transformed, that sets its mornings by chores instead of alarms. Night returns to the basin the way it always has, cool first along the water, then over the clay. Willows give their silver talk in a small wind. The old wall lies where it lies, visible in places, imagined in others, never truly gone because the behavior it taught is permanent when someone practices it. You kneel and fill a gourd on the fresh side and taste the quiet on your tongue. You fill another from the brackish side and spit gently into the reeds. The two flavors are a book you know by heart. You rise, coil a length of reed rope, and feel the softness of damp clay under your soles, the kind that holds shape after the paddle has smoothed it. Above the low rim of the valley, the city hums, heavy and brilliant and thirsty, leaning into its own weight. Beneath all that, the bowl waits with its old patience for small, repeated kindnesses. A screen lowered in time, a seam patted tight, a corner replanted with living nails, a habit taught to a child who will someday tap a wall and listen for water thinking. The lakes go dark. Somewhere in a canal where roots dangle like quiet handwriting, an axolotl lifts its head and blinks. You can almost hear the basin's old sentence form in the reeds again, soft, practical, unhurried, and you wonder what any of us taste when we drink in our sleep. and whether, by morning, we will remember to sip and to listen and to leave a little sweetness in the mouth of the world.